Preamble and significance of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that is UDHR. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the founding document of international human rights. It is not a legally binding document, but it represents a significant right of general references to human rights in UN Charter and provides the ethical and normative basis for subsequent development of human rights law. In its own words, the declaration expresses a common standard of achievements for all people and all nations. Over the last few decades, it has generally helped to bring about new ethos concerning the global community. Although states in international relations previously strictly guarded the doctrine of state sovereignty, international human rights supervision today limit this sovereignty and have become significant factor in internationally known politics and global community. Human rights law has made concern for the freedom and welfare of individual and vulnerable groups. However, it remains challenged by the power of states and non-state actors that pursue interests that violate human rights standards. Arising out of the human atrocities of World War II and the failure of protection of minorities' rights regimes under the League of Nations era. So, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that is UDHR in 1948, represented the hope for a new future, the start of the modern ascent of global human rights, establishing a benchmark for civilized conduct applying to all states in treating their citizens. Drafting of UDHR. The resolution 9/2 of 21st June 1946 was passed to establish commission for drafting the bill for human rights. The first and major task of this commission was to draft an international bill for the human rights. Other priorities included the drafting of declarations or conventions on civil liberties, the status of women, freedom of information and other issues, and to develop measures for the protection of minorities and prevention of discrimination of the grounds of race, sex, language or religion. Another task that provoked considerable controversy over time was dealing with any matter within the field of human rights considered likely to impair the general welfare or friendly relations among nations. In drafting of UDHR, some of the members of the commission played a more prominent role than others. As part of the procedure, a drafting committee of 8 commission members was established shortly after the commission's first session in January 1947. Not surprisingly, the committee's members were particularly influential in directing the work of the commission and included Eleanor Roosevelt, US, René Cassin, France, etc. The head of the UN Division of Human Rights, the Canadian lawyer John Humphrey, also played a central role in drafting this process. Eleanor Roosevelt of the United States was the chairperson of the Commission on Human Rights, the UN body responsible for drafting the declaration. The declaration was adopted as Resolution 217/3 by the UN General Assembly in the Palais de Calliot in Paris just before midnight of 10 December 1948, after a final debate in the General Assembly of 3rd Committee. Resolution 9/2 establishing a Commission of Human Rights said nothing about the status and form of the text to be prepared. Many states like Chile, Egypt, France, UK, etc. suggested drafting a non-binding declaration to be followed immediately by minding a convention for UN member states to ratify. The model was accepted by the Commission. This nature of the text as non-legal declaration implied that it was primarily defined as a document expressing moral and political aspirations such common standards of achievements for all people of all nations. In the General Assembly, the declaration was adopted by the 48 voters in favor, while 8 states abstained. Now, if we look at formal statements, Saudi Arabia abstained because it did not accept the freedom of religion also implied the right to change one's religion. South Africa objected to the inclusion of economic and social rights, while the USSR and 5 other socialist states abstained mainly because corresponding obligations to guarantee the rights of the declaration were not satisfied. In reality, it is likely that Saudi Arabia also objected to the principle of individuals' worth without regard to gender. South Africa no doubt objected to equality without racial distinctions. And the European communists objected to serious respect of civil and political rights in general. Clearly, the United States wanted to keep all human rights language general and unenforceable because its own race relations dilemmas. And in UK was then concerned that human rights norms not be applied too vigorously in its colonies. Let us see the effects of UDHR. The effects of the declaration have been made positive than the drafters had expected. It laid the foundation for all contemporary human rights conventions and declarations, and declaration has also exerted a critical normative and political importance for detailed standard setting and lawmaking, the two most comprehensive treaties being the international covenants and on economics, social and cultural rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The declaration also represents as authoritative interpretation and specification of the Charter's general reference to human rights. Many international lawyers feel that parts of the declaration have become customary international law. The declaration has influenced constitutional developments in many states, especially those post-colonial states achieving legal independence after 1948. The inclusion of economic and social rights was innovative, and a novelty of the Universal Declaration may be considered a marked improvement over previous declarations of rights. It is often assumed that the inclusion of these rights was a result of pressure from socialist countries, in particular the USSR. Let us see the historical background. Universal Declaration is inherently related to the establishment of UN and UN Charter. The establishment of new international order and the international organization serving as an arbitrator of dispute resolution and protector of international peace had been launched and debated during World War II. Most important, the vision of this institution was reflected in Atlantic Charter of 1941, concluded by US President Franklin D. Roosevelt and UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill, establishing certain common principles for a better future for the world. Representatives of the 4 major powers met in 1944 at Dumbarton Oaks, Washington, D.C. The leaders felt there must be a better way for the nations and peoples of the world to live together and sort out their problems, and laid plans for establishment what was to become the United Nations as an international institution. In late 1945, leaders of the world's nations met in San Francisco to form the United Nations. Inspired by the great South African pre-apartheid leader Field Marshal Smuts, they concluded in the preamble of the Charter of the United Nations an important reference to the human rights. A preamble of UN Charter is an important introductory section of a legal document and explains the background to it rather than being part of its operative provision. The relevant part of the preamble said, "We the people of the United Nations are determined to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, of nations large and small. This reference to human rights was followed up by 6 references throughout the UN Charter's operative provisions to human rights and fundamental freedoms. In addition, largely as a result of pressure brought to bear the political leaders by some 42 United States non-government organizations, Article 68 was included. It required the Economic and Social Council to set up commissions in human rights and economic and social fields. The outcome was the establishment of a commission on human rights. Thus, the commission is one of the very few bodies to draw its authority directly from the Charter of United Nations. Let us see the significance. The international community embraced a document considered to have universal value, a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations. Its preamble acknowledges the importance of a human rights legal framework to maintain international peace and security, stating that the recognition of the inherent dignity and equal and inalienable rights of all individuals is the foundation of the freedom, justice and peace in the world. 63 years ago, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a safeguard against oppression and discrimination. In the wake of devastating World War, this had witnessed some of the most barbarous crimes in the human history. The UDHR marked the first time that the rights and the freedoms of individuals were set forth in such detail. It also represented the first international recognition that the human rights and fundamental freedoms are applicable to every person everywhere. In this sense, the Universal Declaration was a landmark achievement in the world history. Today, it continues to affect people's lives and inspire human rights activism and legislation all over the world. In 1948, the then 58 member states of the United Nations represented a range of ideologies, political systems and religious and cultural backgrounds, as well as different stages of economic development. The authors of declaration, themselves from different regions of the world, sought to ensure that the draft text would reflect these different cultural traditions and incorporate common values inherent in the world's principal legal system and religious and philosophical traditions. Most important, the Universal Declaration was to be a common statement of mutual aspirations and shared vision of more equitable and just world. The success of their endeavor is demonstrated by the virtually universal acceptance of the declaration. Today, the Universal Declaration, translated into nearly 250 national and local languages, is the best known and most cited human rights document in the world. The foundation of international human rights law, the Universal Declaration serves as a model for the numerous international treaties and declarations and is incorporated in the constitutions and laws of many countries. Elaborating the United Nations Charter's declared purpose of promoting social progress and well-being in the larger freedom, the declaration gives equal importance to economic, social and cultural rights and to civil rights and political liberties, and affords them the same degree of protection. The declaration has inspired more than 60 international human rights instruments. While not a treaty itself, the declaration was explicitly adopted for the purpose of defining the meaning of the words fundamental freedoms and human rights appearing in the United Nations Charter, which is binding on all member of states. For this reason, the Universal Declaration is a fundamental constitutive document of United Nations. Many international lawyers, in addition, believe that the declaration is a powerful tool in applying diplomatic and moral pressure to governments that violate any of its articles. The 1968 United Nations International Conference on the Human Rights advised that it constitutes an obligation for the members of the international community to all persons. The declaration has served as the foundation for two binding United Nations human rights covenants and civil and political rights, and on economic, social and cultural rights. The principles of the declaration are elaborated in the international treaties, such as the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the International Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the United Nations Convention on the Human Rights of the Child, the United Nations Convention Against Torture, and many more. The declaration continues to be widely cited by governments, academics, advocates and constitutional courts and individual human beings who appeal to its principles for the protection of their recognized human rights. The Universal Declaration covers the range of human rights in 30 clear and concise articles. The first two articles lay the universal foundation of human rights. Human beings are equal, become their shared essence of human dignity. Human rights are universal, not because of any state or international organization, but because they belong to all of humanity. The two articles assure that the human rights are the birthright of everyone, not privileges of a select few, nor privileges to the granted or denied. Article 1 declares that all human beings are born equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reasons and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Article 2 recognizes the universal dignity of a life free from discrimination. Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind of, such as race, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth or other states. The first cluster of articles 3 to 21 sets forth civil and political rights to which everyone is entitled. The right to life, liberty and personal security recognized in Article 3 sets the base for all the political rights and the civil liberties, including freedom from slavery, torture and arbitrary arrests, as well as the right to a fair trial, free speech, free movement and privacy. The second cluster of Article 22 to 27 sets forth the economic, social and cultural rights to which all humankinds are entitled. The cornerstone of this right, Article 22, acknowledging that as a member of society, everyone has the right to social security and is therefore entitled to the realization of the economic, social and cultural rights, indispensable for his or her dignity and free and full personal development. Article 5 elaborates the rights necessary for the enjoyment of the fundamental right to social security, including economic rights related to work, fair remuneration and leisure, social rights concerning an adequate standard of living for health, well-being and education, and the right to participate in cultural life of the community. The third and final cluster of articles 28 to 30 provides a larger protective framework in which all human rights are to be universally enjoyed. Article 28 recognizes the right to social and international order that enables the realization of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Article 29 acknowledges that along with rights, human beings also have obligations to the community, which also enables them to develop their individual potential freely and fully. Article 30 finally protects the interpretation of the articles of the declaration from any outside interference contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. It explicitly states that no state, group or person can claim on the basis of the declaration to have the right to engage in any activity or to perform any act aimed at the destruction of any of the rights and freedoms set forth in the Universal Declaration. Preamble. Preamble to the Universal Declaration. It states general reasons for the declaration. Subsequent articles then list specific rights for all members of the human family. The preamble begins with following statement. Whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice and peace in the world. Every human being is entitled to an inherent dignity, one of the foundations of freedom, justice and peace. An inherent dignity exists merely by virtue of being human. The other foundation is equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. Inalienable rights refer to rights incapable of being surrendered or transferred. These rights exist for everyone, whereas disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. The phrase acknowledges that the horrific experiences of World War II and other disregard and contempt of human rights. In a desire never to repeat those experiences, drafters of the common people is to create a world tolerant of different views, respectful of individual freedoms and mindful of economic security. Whereas it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. Without legal enforcement of human rights, the world could again be tossed into chaotic situation and circumstances. This phrase contemplates respect for the human rights by government through legal frameworks. The reflection in regard to the weakness of the League of Nations and that organization's ineffective enforcement structure prompted concern over how nations would treat human rights. While the provision envisions legal enforcement, the use of the word should be protected by the rule of law indicates the non-binding nature of the declaration. Whereas it is essential to promote the development of friendly relations between nations. This provision highlights the importance of international relations and necessity of getting along. The concept of human rights would promote amicable dealings between countries and, by extension, individuals from different countries. Whereas the people of the United Nations have in the Charter reaffirmed their faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person and in the equal rights of men and women, and have determined to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. Regardless of what has happened in the past, all members of the United Nations agree to the need of human rights. Moreover, they believe in human dignity and equal rights of men and women. The last part of this phrase denotes a desire to improve overall living standards in the context of greater individual freedom. This wording indicates the vagueness of certain concepts such as freedom. Whereas member states have pledged themselves to achieve, in cooperation with the United Nations, the promotion of the universal respect for and observance of the human rights and fundamental freedoms. This phase highlights a pledge by any member of the United Nations to promote human rights and basic freedoms everywhere. In this statement, the declaration adds the fundamental freedom, remember fundamental freedom, to the human rights without specifying those freedoms in later article. Once again, freedom is a very relative concept, and any definition of freedom must be taken into account in numerous factors, including cultural, political and social traditions. Whereas a common understanding of these rights and freedoms is of the greatest importance for full realization of this pledge. Not only does an understanding of human rights and freedoms important, but a common understanding also plays a key role in realizing universal human rights. In other words, opinions on what human rights and freedoms mean should every correlate or at least bear some resemblance. Now, therefore, the General Assembly proclaims this Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations, to the end that every individual and organ of society, keeping this declaration constantly in mind, shall strive by teaching and educating to promote respect for these rights and freedoms, and by progressive measures national and international to secure their universal and effective recognition and observance, both among the people of the member states themselves and among the people of territories under their jurisdiction. This proclamation obligates signatories of the declaration to promulgate human rights and explain them to people of the member states. Perhaps this provision is one of the most frequently violated by signatories. Conclusion: the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the document which gives the basic human rights. Thus, Magna Carta of all the humanity contains a preamble and 30 separate articles, each detailing specific rights that belongs to human everywhere, including the principles of non-discrimination, civil and political rights, and economic and social rights. At the World Conference on Human Rights held in Vienna, Austria in 1993, 171 countries reaffirmed their commitment to the UDHR. The fundamental rights articulated in the UDHR include the right to life, liberty and security of person, the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to seek asylum, the right to freedom of expression, the right to education, and the right to freedom from torture, among others. Today, human rights have been used as a tool in foreign policy rather than making sure that the rights described within it are respected at home. In the end, I would like to conclude this lecture with words of Eleanor Roosevelt. I quote, "Remember always that you not only have the right to be an individual, you have an obligation to be one. For peace isn't enough to talk about peace. One must believe in it, and it isn't enough to believe in it. One must work at it." I think that somehow we learn who we really are and then live with that decision. Thank you for your patient hearing and listening to the lecture.